invasion is targeting Khan Yunis. This Gaza's second largest city. Thousands of Palestinians have been forced there from their homes. While in the north, Israeli forces are battling Palestinian fighters from the Qassam Brigade and Islamic Jihad in these regions shaded in red. There's also heavy fighting in several neighborhoods in Gaza City. All the fighting and troop movements indicate that Israel is aiming to divide the Gaza Strip into three areas: the north, central region, and the south. Okay, well, let's introduce now Hossam Abu Shamala, who lives in Gaza. He used to study English at the Al-Azhar University before it was bombed just over a month ago. Hossam, a very warm welcome to you. So can you firstly tell us where exactly you are in the Strip and describe the conditions that you and others are living in now? I understand that you have already lived through 4 wars in the past. Did you ever imagine destruction on this scale?
Good morning. So first of all, I'm from the central area in a town called Deir al-Balah. As you probably know, today marks the day 60 of the ongoing war. In these days, all of the people in Gaza have grew up hundreds of years. Personally, I've went through 4 previous wars, but they are all combined, are nothing compared to one day in this aggression. The amount of massacres, ethnic cleansing, and displacing people multiple times. If we look at the statistics alone, Israel already passed the number of the Nakba. From October the 7th till now, the lives of 2.4 million people here in Gaza have completely changed forever. According to the latest statistics, more than 20,000 people were killed, in addition to those who are still lost under the rubble. Now we're at the point that it's quite impossible to find someone that didn't lose anyone, whether from his family, friends, relatives, or someone from work or school. And you will be considered lucky if you only lost one person. Personally, from my, as you know, to the nature of the Palestinian and Arab communities, it's a very intact community because everyone knows everyone.
Right.
Personally, from my own family, Abu Shamala family, I lost 120 people. I lost 10 friends and the cat.
Hossam, that's an extraordinary number of relatives to lose, 120, and it's very striking also that you say that we have exceeded now the Nakba, otherwise known as the catastrophe, that point in 1948 where Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homeland during the formation of the State of Israel. I wonder if you can help us understand how dire the humanitarian situation is there at the moment, given the restrictions on aid reaching those who desperately need it.
Regarding the humanitarian aid, let's say, personally, not I, nor my family, nor anyone I know received any of these aids. So we can see them enter via Rafah border, but we buy them from the markets. Now, it literally says not for sale, but I buy it from the market. Am I considered a criminal in this state? I don't think so, because if I didn't buy it with a huge overprice in it, my family and I would starve, because there are starving prices, a famine starting here in Gaza.
Yeah,
that raises another question.
Well, Hossam, it appears as if the crisis has many levels, doesn't it? So now tell me this, because the Israeli army says they've given clear instructions on where people should escape to. They say they've dropped leaflets and given people QR codes to use. Where are people being told to go that is safe?
Now, starting of all, in the first time, when the starting of the ground operation, let's say, the IDF told people to go from the north and Gaza to the south as a relatively safe pass, right? At the same time, they bombed cars there. While people were in them, people were moving to the south, according to the IDF instructions. The same thing happened to those who are in the south. They told people in Khan Yunis to go to Rafah and also bombed them. There is literally no safe place. In addition, schools, hospitals, ambulances, they're all being targeted at all given time. Not only that, the random targeting of artillery weapons, the tanks, they shoot at random objects. The main objective is to create as much damage to the people and infrastructure for Gaza. Another thing regarding the QR codes, I can consider myself one of the very few lucky people here in Gaza. They can have internet. They manage to get internet access. How can I scan the QR code if I don't have any internet access? Because all the networks are down because of the intense bombing, same as the eSIMs. Not all the people have eSIMs, not all the devices have eSIMs, not all the places have eSIM coverage.
Hossam, can I ask you this? Because you mentioned the destruction of important infrastructure, and as I mentioned in the introduction to you, you did study at the Al-Azhar University. That was destroyed in a major strike just over a month ago. What does the loss of a place of learning like that mean for you and the people of Gaza?
For me personally, I spent 4 of my most beautiful years of my life in this university. I had my best moment in life less than a month ago before the war started. I graduated from that university. I never thought I'm going to see it flattened to the ground just like that. This is also, let's say, an indicator that Israel is targeting the elite. It's targeting the places of knowledge, because targeting both the Islamic and Azhar University, which are considered the two biggest universities here in Gaza. They want to raise up an illiterate generation, but that's not going to happen. Why? Because a couple of days ago, I was talking with my friends, say what left of my friends, those who are still alive. After this war ends, what do you want to do? We all started saying, I want to obtain masters in doing this. I want to study this. I want to work in that. Education is the key, literally, to everything.
As you say, Hossein, education is the key indeed. And just before we came on air, I took a look at your blog, and it's called We Are Not Numbers. Is that your fear, that the world has oversimplified this conflict into just numbers rather than individuals with their own experiences, with their own hopes and fears?
Unfortunately, that seems what is happening, because there's something in sports called conditioning the bone, which is putting certain stress over the bone over a prolonged period of time to make it withstand this stress like it's nothing. Same thing happens when we repeat the saying, 1,000 Palestinians killed, 1,000 Palestinians died, as the Israeli propaganda says. And also they dehumanize us. So when you give the number 20,000, you won't be shocked, because they are not humans. And this is the main goal of the Israeli propaganda. So yeah, I can say that a lot of the people in the world are getting used to that, getting used to hearing Palestinian casualties, Palestinian murders in the news on a daily basis, especially for the past 60 days.
Hossein, it has been very important and very powerful to hear your testimony, and our deepest condolences for the loss of, as you said, 120 friends and family. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us.
An attempt to stop the suffering in Gaza, the UN chief invokes a rare power to pressure the Security Council over a ceasefire. You're watching Al Jazeera live from Doha with me, fully backable. Also ahead, an Israeli airstrike hits a home in Rafah in southern Gaza, killing at least 18 Palestinians. Israeli airstrikes hit the Jabalia refugee camp once again, killing 22 family members of an Al Jazeera correspondent. And Israeli forces carry out more raids in the occupied West Bank. At least 4 Palestinians are killed. Gaza has endured another day of mass killing from its north to the south. In just the last few hours, Israeli bombs hit this home near the southern city of Rafah. The strike killed 18 members of the same family, but happened in one of the few areas Israel has said is a safe zone. And in central Gaza, rescuers have been desperately trying to reach people trapped under the rubble after an Israeli airstrike hit the Al-Maghazi refugee camp in Deir al-Balah. At least 17 people were killed, but many more are missing. Meanwhile, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has invoked his most powerful diplomatic tool to try to stop the killing of Palestinians in Gaza. He is directing the Security Council to discuss the humanitarian catastrophe and is calling for an urgent ceasefire. Israel has dismissed the move as a new moral law and said Guterres should resign. Kristen Salome has more from New York.
Representatives of the group Doctors Without Borders gathered outside the United Nations to call for an end to the fighting in Gaza. 4 of their colleagues have been killed there and many more injured, even though healthcare workers in facilities can't be targeted under international law.
The targeting of medical facilities, the fact that ambulances continue to be targeted, the fact that we don't have the fuel necessary or the medicines necessary to be able to provide support in the hospitals is intolerable.
Over 100 humanitarians have died in Gaza, and the UN says aid deliveries are now virtually impossible. As the war in Gaza approaches 60 days with more than 16,000 casualties, the pressure on the United Nations Security Council is mounting from outside and inside the UN to demand a humanitarian ceasefire. In a letter to the Security Council, Secretary General Antonio Guterres invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter, a rarely used tool to put an issue seen as a threat to international peace and security before the Security Council.
It is a very powerful move on behalf of the Secretary General, and we hope that members of the Security Council will be moved by it, and we hope the international community will be moved by it to push and put in place a humanitarian ceasefire.
Israel's ambassador called the move more evidence of UN bias against Israel, and the United States has said it is opposed to further council action. But Arab and Islamic countries at the UN are looking to amplify the Secretary General's call.
And hundreds of thousands of our brothers and sisters of Palestine are abandoned without a shelter in southern Gaza. We're calling the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities. The Arab group, once again, is knocking on the doors of the Security Council.
They are sending foreign ministers to Washington on Thursday in hopes of winning U.S. support for a humanitarian ceasefire resolution that could be put to a vote as soon as Friday. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
While Israel has been pursuing its unrelenting attacks from the north to the south of the Gaza Strip, the new phase of Israel's ground invasion is targeting Khan Yunis in the south. It's Gaza's second largest city. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been forced there from their homes. In the north, Israeli forces are battling Palestinian fighters from the Qassam brigades and Islamic Jihad in these regions shaded in red. There's also heavy fighting in several neighborhoods in Gaza City. All the fighting and troop movements indicate that Israel is aiming to divide the Gaza Strip into 3 areas: the north, central region, and the south. While thousands of displaced Palestinians have made the trek to the town of Al-Mawasi, the area along the southern coast of the Gaza Strip has been deemed a safe zone by Israeli forces, but rights groups reject the claim as the area lacks any humanitarian aid, and many fear it might be their final resting place. Imran Ullah Khan reports.
Row by row they stand, just barely, providing shelter to thousands of newly displaced Palestinians, looking for safety from Israel's bombardment of Gaza, even if it's momentarily. The narrow strip known as Al-Mawasi has become the newest tent city for displaced Palestinians, a desolate, barren area where all of its occupants have a tragic story to tell.
My family were forcibly displaced from Hamad City. This is our destiny, but we are holding our ground. We only left when they started carpet bombing the city, when 8 towers were leveled. We left our homes and all of our possessions. We're living in the open, exposed to the fierce cold and rain. There is nowhere to go.
Al-Mawasi is a town on the southern coast of the Gaza Strip. The area is only 1 kilometer wide and 14 kilometers. Many Palestinians came to this area with very few personal belongings and the scars of war. Israeli forces say the area is a humanitarian safe zone, but rights groups on the ground reject that claim and say it's a dangerous false narrative. There's no food, no water, no sanitation, no hope.
My husband was killed years ago. My only son, who I exhausted my life for raising, was killed by the Israeli military. He was killed in his prime, murdered by the Israelis. I lost my husband, my brothers and sisters, and lately my son too. I'm left alone in this world. What to do? Bury myself? I'm losing my mind.
There is no expectation their situation will change. For now, they have each other, perhaps the only comfort they can take in these uncertain times. Imran Ullah Khan, Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera correspondent Momin Al-Sharafi has lost 22 members of his family in Israeli airstrikes. Al-Sharafi lost his mother and father along with his siblings, nieces and nephews when the Jabalia refugee camp was bombed by the Israeli army early on Wednesday morning. Momin was in Khan Yunis when the strike happened. This is what he had to say about losing his family.
My father was killed. He was 87 years old. He lived through the Nakba in 1948, where he was forcibly expelled out of his village to the northwest of the Gaza Strip. He was 12 years old then. Those bitterly painful events remain carved in his memory until the day he was killed. He used to recount to me the most detailed specifics. He never forgot the names of his neighbours or those who marched with him in their forcible exodus from his village to Jabalia refugee camp to the north of Gaza. He's been carrying those bitter moments with him. That is why he refused to relive the same vicious event. He always feared being expelled south or out of the Strip. He held his ground to the last moment and preferred to die holding on to his roots, especially since he was a history teacher who taught thousands of students throughout his career. So did my mother, who served in the education field for 35 years. They always rejected the idea of forcible expulsion by the Israeli occupation forces that took the land. They refused to succumb to pressures. They moved from home to home, refusing to leave the north. That was their destiny, and all I can say is that God is our rock. He is the disposer of all affairs. God is our refuge, and from whom only we gain strength.
Al Jazeera Media Network has denounced the bombing. In a statement, it said it will pursue all legal steps to hold those accountable for this crime. It calls on the international community and press freedom organizations to work to put an end to these massacres immediately and ensure prompt justice for the families of the innocent victims. Now, Israeli media is reporting of deep divisions during the latest meeting of the Israeli cabinet. Whether to allow fuel and humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip was also on the agenda. Let's bring in Hamda Salhout, who's in occupied East Jerusalem, for us more on this. What more do we know about the decisions that were made during this Security Cabinet meeting, Hamda?
Well, Israel's Security Cabinet voted to allow fuel inside of the Gaza Strip at the recommendation of the country's war cabinet, but it didn't come without disagreements. Two ministers in the coalition ended up voting against it, both known ultra-nationalists, the country's national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who accused the government of moving Israel's red lines and said that this fuel would fall into the hands of Hamas. Now, the Israeli government has been under immense U.S. pressure to allow fuel and more humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Now, what will be allowed is 120,000 liters of fuel. Previously, during the ceasefire period, there was 60,000 liters of fuel being allowed in daily. However, the United States recommended triple that amount, but the Israelis came back with only double. The Israeli War Cabinet additionally said that they will reevaluate this decision based on the humanitarian situation inside of the Gaza Strip and how it unfolds. They said that the fuel will be used for hospitals, for desalination plants, and for water pumps, and that they also don't want to see the spread of diseases and the outbreaks of epidemics in the Gaza Strip. But the reality of the situation is 2 months in, that has already happened, as there has been documentation of disease and other illnesses spreading throughout the population in the Gaza Strip.
And Hamda, there is a leaked audio of a meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and captives who were recently released. What do we know happened during that meeting?
Well, this is the first meeting of its kind. Captives who were released from Gaza meeting with the country's war cabinet and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Essentially, they attacked the war cabinet, saying that the government wasn't doing enough. They also said that during their time in captivity, they felt extremely afraid and neglected. And the fear came from the Israeli shellings and the Israeli airstrikes that they say other captives were wounded in. They said that they weren't afraid of dying in the hands of Hamas as they were by the Israeli bombardment. They additionally said that they want to see prisoner exchanges, and they continuously told the government that they are simply not doing enough and that there needs to be a system where everyone can be brought back from the Gaza Strip. This is a continuation of the pressure that the families of the captives and the Israeli society have been putting on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but it's the first time it's coming from the captives themselves face to face with the Israeli premier, and he reportedly responded to them very angrily, saying that he simply could not bring everyone back alive, which led these captives to then say that they were not a priority to the Israeli government and their lives were not a priority to the Israeli army as well, and they are calling on the government for more decisive action on how to bring back all of the captives in the Gaza Strip.
Hamda, thank you very much for that. Hamda Salhout reporting live from occupied East Jerusalem.
Organisation for weeks. That perfect storm is beginning, and that is because this massive influx of people with absolutely nowhere to go. So the real risk now, the horrendous numbers of thousands and thousands of children killed, continually being killed as you and I speak, risks being matched by deaths from disease. That's what we get when they're pushed to these zones that are anything other than safe.
IDF would counter that by saying there is a stretch of land close to the sea in the southwest of the Strip, which is about 14,000 kilometres, something like that, square kilometres, and that it is a safe place for Gazans to be. I've spoken to other people who say there is literally nothing there, there's no infrastructure, there is nothing that will allow people to live there safely. Do you know this area? What can you tell us about it?
I do. It's called Al-Mawasi. It's exactly 1k by 14, so 14 square kilometres. It makes up about 4% of Gaza, Gaza being one of the most densely populated places on the planet. So it's about 4% of Gaza, and it would require 80% of the population to be there. If you imagine a car park of people stacked on top of each other, still without a toilet, still without a drop of water. So here you would absolutely have zones that are zones of disease and would become, in any sane projection, zones of death. So it's such an important narrative to break, this idea that people can just go to a safe zone if they wish. There is absolutely nothing safe about this, and I think, hey, to be honest, those people making these decisions and telling people to go there, they're aware of that. This is calculated, it's cold, and it speaks to the indiscriminate nature and the lack of any sense of decency that has been enacted on relentless attacks on mums and kids and families.
Whoa.
We hold Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu fully responsible for the lives of Israeli hostages.
Opinion polls have shown significant support among the Israeli public for the war. But a recent survey suggests more than half of respondents were in favor of extending the ceasefire with Hamas to enable the release of more captives. So, unless there's another breakthrough, the ordeal of those being held and the agony of their relatives looks set to continue. Fintan Monaghan for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests. In the Israeli town of Pardes Chana is Udi Goren, a cousin of one of the captives detained in Gaza, who has taken part in the Bring Them Home Now campaigns. In West Jerusalem is Gershon Baskin, a former hostage negotiator and founder of the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information. That's a joint public policy think tank. And in Tel Aviv is Akiva Elder, a political analyst, veteran journalist, and author of Lords of the Land, the war over Israel's settlements in the occupied territories. A warm welcome to all of you. Udi, if I can start with you. Of course, we appreciate the huge amount of anguish this has caused for the likes of you and other families who have been affected by the captive situation. Those captives, of course, held in Gaza. Can I start by asking you what it was like to find out that your cousin had been kidnapped and indeed taken to Gaza?
Yeah, it was a complete shock. It's, it's something that's so far removed from our world that it's something you hear that happens in in developing countries and in places that are not considered like we consider ourselves, a Western safe, sovereign democracy. And it's just a situation that's completely taken everyone out of balance. to have, your cousin not detained, being kept prisoner. He's a civilian being held hostage. It's unimaginable to this very day. It's unimaginable.
And Akiva, if I can bring you in your view, how receptive has the Netanyahu war cabinet been in responding to the demands that have been growing by the day in Israel to procure the release of these captives?
Well, I think that it depends which network they watch and which newspaper they read. Netanyahu is very busy these days. Actually, his trial has just resumed, and he thinks about his own future. And this is the context that you have to put into your question. They are very careful to meet the families, but at the same time, they haven't got anything to offer them. Like in this meeting yesterday, they want to have it both ways. They say, well, we will not stop until we wipe the Hamas off the face of the earth, but at the same time, we will do everything to bring the people back. They know, Netanyahu and Gallant, the Minister of Defense, that they are responsible personally, because it's not just people who were lost in a war or they were taken hostage in a war. It's a blunder. It's a huge blunder, and the blood of 1,200 people is on their hands, and the future and the whereabouts of now about 200 civilians and soldiers that we know very little about what's happening to them right now while we talk.
And Gershon, just responding to something that Akiva mentioned there, this final meeting that Benjamin Netanyahu granted to some of the family members of those held in Gaza, that was on Tuesday, in which he reportedly said it's currently not possible right now to bring them all back at once. From a negotiating perspective, what does it mean for the families to hear a message like that coming from the Prime Minister?
Right. First of all, I think it's important to note that it's probably the first time the Prime Minister told the truth, because the price that Hamas is demanding for bringing all the hostages home is a price that the government of Israel, the army, the people of Israel, I sense, are not willing to pay at this time. It's a double price. One is freeing some 7,600 Palestinian prisoners, including 559 of them serving life sentences for killing Israelis, another 130 of the terrorists who were caught in Israel on October 7th. But Hamas is also requiring a cessation of the war, meaning that they would emerge from the tunnels and their bunkers being victorious. And this is a price that Israel is not willing to pay. So it seems very correct, because the only way of bringing all the hostages home is through a negotiated agreement with Hamas. Otherwise, it's going to have to rely either on a partial agreement or on military operations aimed at search and rescue, which are very dangerous.
Right. We'll get on to talking about the prospects of a negotiated solution to all of this. But first, Udi, can I ask you, from what you've heard of the experiences of people who have been released from Gaza, what concerns you the most about their experiences?
What really concerns us all is that they might share the same fate as their captives, because we now know that they're affected by the Israeli bombings, even though we know 100% that the military is not going to strike anywhere they think there might be a hostage, and yet they don't know everything. So we know they're affected by it. We know that they're not only might be injured by it, but it also scares them to death, as they don't really know what's happening around them. They could be taken anywhere. They have been moved around. And aside from that, the daily life, they're not on vacation. Some of them have been tormented. There's no food in the Gaza Strip for everyone, let alone for them. and the living conditions are dire. Those who were held in the tunnels suffer tremendously from the health risks that you can imagine there are in staying in a damp tunnel with no air, no proper ventilation, with unbelievable humidity, and every day to tackle is just further risk to their lives, to their actual survival.
Gershon, in response to that, whichever way you want to rotate this, whatever happened on October the 7th has to be classed as an absolute failure of Israeli intelligence, military intelligence, given the amount of money, international money, particularly from the United States, that's poured into propping up the Israeli armed forces. Reports also of a number of Israelis who were killed by the Israeli military itself. How much confidence is there in Israel about this current bombing campaign in Gaza when it comes to securing something resembling a lasting peace?
Unfortunately, I think that too many Israelis believe the Israeli government, the spokespeople, the army, military people, the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister, when they say that this bombing, the renewal of the war, will create more pressure on Hamas in order to release the hostages, where it could actually be the quite opposite. We don't know. Everyone is guessing. It is a guessing game of military people against other people like myself who don't buy this line that the military pressure increases the chances of releasing the hostages. I think it might actually be the quite opposite, and it might actually lead to the death of too many of these hostages.
And Udi, I mean, the majority of UN members, even the United States, are now showing a degree of disquiet about the war that's currently being waged in Gaza. With this in mind, how receptive do you think the Israeli government is to public international criticism of what's happening?
I think I would largely agree with what Gershon has said. I think that the general public opinion, and it's also reflected by the government, is that aside from the fact that we suffered such a tremendous loss of faith on October 7th, but people in Israel are really scared. They are scared, and they're demanding the government to persist. And I don't think everybody realizes the repercussions that we're discussing right now, that these two targets do not go together. And one of the messages we're trying to convey is that we think that in order to move forward, Israel must deal with the western border and the safety of its civilians, and absolutely something must change in this regional order. But with this objective in mind, and when you have another objective that's rescuing 136 lives, one is time sensitive, and the other one would definitely take months, at least months, to do. So the priority between the two must be clear when there are civilians' lives on the line, that every day may be their last.
Right, I can see you all nodding your heads to what Udi has just said. Gershon, if I can ask you this, what happens to this pervading sense of righteous indignation when it comes to perpetuating this conflict to reach its ultimate game of destroying Hamas? That, of course, is what Netanyahu wants to do.
I think that the fact that Israel faced the biggest trauma in its history, in fact, the biggest trauma of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, impacts directly on the decision-making of the government, the army, and with the support of the people. The overriding objective of the war to dismantle Hamas's ability to ever govern and control the territory of Gaza, again, seems to me to be overriding the desire of the public to bring the hostages home. There was a brief period during the time when the hostages were coming home, when there was a ceasefire, that it seemed that that was the number one priority. But when the torture of every night watching whether or not Hamas was going to release these people, and the humiliation that they went through as they were being released, created the mood once again in the country where the war objective seems to be once again overriding, unfortunately, for the lives of the hostages and their families who are continuing to go through this torture every day.
Akiva, your thoughts on that? Where this sense of righteous indignation currently stands in Israel?
Well, I believe that we have to put it, and this is why the Americans are putting this in a broader context. Israel has also to offer the facilitators of a possible deal, primarily Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, how Israel sees the day after. Hamas, of course, is now under great pressure. They have thousands of fatalities, and
Akiva, let me ask you this, because how Israel perceives the so-called day after also is impacted on how Israel sees the Palestinians going forward as well. Is there much sympathy towards the plight of Palestinians in Gaza, and indeed the West Bank since October the 7th, given, of course, the high civilian death toll in Gaza, and, of course, the thousands of Palestinians continue to be detained in the West Bank?
It's a very good question that if you put it forward to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he will tell you it's not the time to deal with it, as well as with the series of blunders in the war. But the United States, I understand, insists on getting much clearer answers, because this today is the 61st day since the terrible incident in around Gaza. But the Americans and the Qataris, who are deeply involved in the negotiations for the deal that will bring the captives back home, they also need to know how Israel is the end game. And the Israeli public needs to know that, because the deal to get now the captives is part of a comprehensive settlement that will bring also about 500,000 soldiers back home. And maybe you need to understand, every Israeli family knows someone who was either killed or kidnapped on October 7th. So everybody is personally involved in this.
Let's take a look at the negotiating process in a bit more detail. Gershon, returning to that, I mean, because for 7 days it seemed like the process was working, didn't it? Until, of course, it rapidly collapsed. Israel blames Hamas for not handing over military captives. Hamas says it wants to increase the number of its prisoners released in return for widening the category of captives released. Of course, there is a precedent for this. You were involved in it directly in the exchange of Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier, who was held for 5 years by Hamas, and he was exchanged for 1,027 Palestinians. Why are swaps on this scale, or indeed all-for-all swaps, apparently out of the question right now?
I think that the negotiations didn't break down over the new demands of Hamas for a larger number of prisoners to be released. I think that is doable, and I think the Israelis will have no choice but to agree to that. What I understand is the main problem is that there remains 14 or 15 young women between the age of 20 and 30 who remain as hostages in Gaza, and they were the ones that Israel wanted to bring out. And according to what the intelligence has been telling us, they've undergone abusive attacks and rapes, sexual abuse by their captors, and the captors, the Hamas no longer want to release them because of the stories that they will have to tell. This is what we understand is the reason, and if this is the case, this is beyond something that Israel is capable of negotiating on. There will be another deal made. I believe there's a chance for it to release the elderly, the young, the people who are not soldiers, the sick and the wounded, and Israel release hundreds and maybe thousands of prisoners in exchange for them. But this story of the young women is very, very painful, and if it's true, it's horrendous.
Right, as far as we are aware, Gershon, that is now subject to a UN investigation looking into allegations of war crimes on both sides of the divide.
Investigate because they have no access.
Right.
Okay. The international Red Cross.
Right. It has also been denied by Hamas. We need to obviously apply a degree of healthy skepticism. Okay, well,
right, but there's no reason for us to believe Hamas in its denial. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever. We know that there was mass raping that took place at the music festival in Ra'im on the day that the massacre of 370 young Israelis took place there as well.
Right, well, I hope, given the circumstances, an investigation, if given access, if given more information, is able to independently verify this. If I could ask you this, what the perception would be for Israelis, for there to be a much wider, much broader number of Palestinians released, if that meant the possibility of all the captives in Gaza also being freed?
I think that it would spark a huge discussion in Israel, but overall, we know that there is a very large support in the public and awareness that this would have to be the price of the return of the hostages. There are more people that are for it than against it. And of course, this is something that would have to be communicated well by the government, let alone, that we are now living through this trauma of Yahya Sinwar, which is the one that initiated this attack and was one of the people released on the Gilad Shalit deal. And yet, Israel has ways to not only to communicate and make this happen, but also to be much smarter about the way.
Just to remind our viewers. Just to remind our viewers, Yahya Sinwar, now perhaps one of the most wanted Hamas figures in Gaza at the moment, who's released as part of the swap with Gilad Shalit. Akiva, if I could bring you in on this, because however you look at this, it looks as if the fate of Israelis, the fate of Palestinians on both sides are inextricably linked. There's no way you can solve one situation without resolving the other.
Yes, and I believe that both sides are looking for an opportunity to raise a flag, even if it's a white flag. But at the same time, they need the victory image or the victory footage. And as you mentioned, capturing Yahya Sinwar or making him raise a white flag can bring an end to the tragedy on both sides.
So do you see that as being regarded as a strategic victory for Netanyahu to be able to claim if he is able to locate Yahya Sinwar? Would that be enough?
Well, strategic victory is putting an end to the conflict and promoting a two-state solution, negotiated solution. I think that this is a kind of a media victory for Netanyahu and maybe for Hamas. Everybody needs to be able to declare victory after so many fatalities and such a big damage to Gaza and to the Israeli economy and prestige.
Right. So, gentlemen, as we approach the end of the program, I want you to give us, if possible, a brief final thought on perhaps what needs to be said to the Israeli war cabinet that isn't perhaps being heard loudly enough at the moment. If I can start with you, Akiva.
I think that the Israeli cabinet is in a big dilemma. Actually, I don't envy them. It's doomed if you do, it's doomed if you don't. The expectations of the average Israeli in the street is to get the captives back, but that it will not happen to us again. And I don't think that anybody, there is no Israeli politician academic or a journalist that can guarantee. Even, somebody was suggesting to pump water from the sea and pour it into the tunnels. Right. But what they kept it out there. So I don't see any easy solution.
Right, no easy solution. Gershon, if I can bring you in, we're going to close in a couple of minutes. Gershon, very briefly.
Right, well, I'll tell you what I told members of the War Cabinet. They have to make an offer to Hamas that they can't refuse. And what I mean by that is that we need to make an offer to bring home at least all the civilian hostages, the women who are left there, the elderly, the sick, and the wounded, at least those, and that's more than half of the hostages. And they have to be willing to tell Hamas what they're willing to give, which is a large number of prisoners in exchange.
Okay, thank you. Udi, last few seconds.
Think outside the box. Israel is renowned for making things happen in face of adversity and in face of situations that are impossible.
So think outside the box.
We can bring all of them back home.
Okay, well, thank you all for your thoughts throughout this discussion. Thanks to all our guests, Udi Goren, Gershon Baskin, and Akiva Eldem. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Niamh Barker, and the whole team here, bye for now.